gas, wind, waterfalls. All of these natural resources are important for our economies. But none of these are the key resource for our sustained welfare. That's humans, our skills, our competencies, our talent, our labor. Yeah. The Ministry of Finance in Norway reports that current and future labor accounts for 75% of our nation's wealth. Capital and natural resources account for 25%. So clearly, it is vital that we allocate labor efficiently in order to maintain our level of wealth and welfare in the future. Equality, in the meaning of the absence of discrimination, is primarily a fundamental human right, of course, but it's also economically efficient. For example, if the barriers to employment are very high for a certain group, say women, and the demand for their type of competencies and skill is high at the same time, but labor supply and labor demand are not able to meet, we have frictions in the labor market, and frictions are inefficient. So gender equality could in that case improve the efficiency of the labor market. And in situations where we have employers who only recruit from half of our pool of talent, for instance, equality may lead to better allocation of our human capital. Higher efficiency in production of goods and services is also a potential consequence of higher female employment and more gender equality, due to specialization and economies of scale. So this perspective that equality also yields high returns, that it increases our production and enhances economic growth, is one of the backbones of the broad public and political support for gender equality policies in Norway and the other Nordic countries. So today, 1.2 million women goes to work in Norway, making up nearly half of our workforce. But this gender-balanced workforce has not always been the case. In the 50s, for instance, we had what we can call the golden age for housewives. Men worked, women also worked, but they worked unpaid in the home, caring and providing for the families. Throughout the 60s, the 70s, women increasingly fought for the right to gain higher education, for the right to work, and for the right to plan their careers. So the educational revolution, modernization, technological change, new norms, and new preferences for female work led to increased labor supply among women. At the same time, at least in Norway and the other Nordic countries, we also experienced higher demand for labor. The service sector increased, it grew, and in particular due to the expansion of the welfare state. And then the demand for especially female labor also increased. In addition, we had some institutional changes. The Gender Equality Act and the ILO Equal Remuneration Convention prohibited direct and indirect discrimination of women. But we also had the introduction of generous welfare and family policies. And we also had the access to part-time work, which reduced some of the barriers that women experienced in balancing work and family obligations. None of these movements happened isolated from the other, but all of them are very important for the rising female employment over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and also into the 21st century. So through these 4 decades, our labor market in Norway expanded. Our input of labor into production increased, and our mainland gross domestic product, which is the GDP without oil and gas, grew by 2% annually since 1972 to 2013. 90% of this growth is due to productivity growth, due to technological improvements, more production capital, and also higher education, but 10% is due to growth in employment, meaning more hours worked. The entire 10% is attributable to female employment growth. In fact, we also had employment growth among men, but this was offset by a reduction in work hours. So men's contribution to our economic growth in terms of employment or hours worked is 0% over this period. So much of women's employment growth was channeled through the expansion of the welfare state. The welfare state employs many women, and the welfare state also have transferred some of the tasks that previously was part of the private sphere, like caring for young children and elderly. So part of this restructuring process led to what we can call altered bookkeeping. Now in our production, we count things that we previously did not count. So this altered bookkeeping, all these simultaneous processes that happened at the same time, makes it a bit hard for me as an economist to identify the true effect of women on the economy. So are there any ways of quantifying this economic benefit of raised female employment? Well, my approach is best understood as a thought experiment or maybe a time travel. So if we all just go back to the 70s, to the time where women's opportunities in the labor market were fewer, and to a time when, at least in Norway, we only employed 600,000 women. Then we imagine that the processes that led to increased female employment never happened. We just employ 600,000 women each year for a 40 years period. What will the value of our market-based production be then? Well, our labor input will be lower, so our production will be lower. And in fact, it would be 3.3 trillion Norwegian kroners lower accumulated over the entire period. To put it differently, raised female employment has contributed to production worth 3.3 million since the 70s. This amounts to 9% of our accumulated GDP over the period. So despite this significant contribution of women into our economic growth and into our production, it is appropriate to ask another question. What if the labor market had been even more gender equal? Today, the participation in labor market, as I showed, is nearly gender balanced, but we know that the part-time share among women is still at staggering 40%. So let's now imagine that all women worked as much as men. That means basically that they work full-time. Then the labor input into production would be higher, and it and our GDP would have been 2.3 trillion Norwegian kroners higher for the entire period. So these numbers are quite stylized examples, rely on some would say strong assumptions. But we have reasons to believe that these amounts are lower-bound estimates of the benefits of gender equality in terms of market production. Here we've only counted the hours worked. We have not counted the quality of the labor. And we all know that the educational revolution has gone very far, and now women outnumber men in the higher education institutions. We also know that the benefits of women in the workforce and the benefits of gender equality goes far beyond market production. It's important for women's economic liberation, it's important for their empowerment, it's important for men, it's important for children, it's important for the society. And these are factors that's not straightforward to quantify in any meaningful way. So I have this one take-home message from me to all of you, and that is the following. In one of the most gender equal countries in the world, where labor force participation rate is gender balanced, we still have underused and valuable labor resources among women. I feel it's fair to say that we have not reached our full economic potential yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much.